I've noticed that I've uploaded an instruction document for assignment for Practical 2 in the course resources folder, in the assignment docs folder. The first document is Practical 2. Someone had a question regarding the submission date for this exercise, which I think we did mention on Tuesday, but just to confirm, according to the course outline, I scheduled the submission date 23 May, okay, at 11 p.m. Okay, so block 1 is due on Sunday, May 23 at 11 p.m. just to avoid any confusion about that. Okay. Are there any questions from your side regarding the assignment? Anyone? It's clear to all of you what is expected. I included some examples in the document. Maybe I should just go through the document with you. So there's some instructions up here, and yeah, I think I did go through this with you actually on Tuesday. But since I didn't record, I'll just quickly browse through it again. So there are 3 topics. You choose the topic that you'll blog about based on the topic that you're going to write your essay about, okay? So they shouldn't differ because you're going to sink a lot of time into Practical 2, which includes both a blog post as well as grading the blog post of one of your peers and commenting on the blog post of one of your peers. So you want to make sure that you choose a topic that you're gonna, for your blog post, that will also coincide with what your essay will be on. And again, there are 4 topics to choose from. Topic 1 deals with developing countries' responses to climate change. That is particularly the mitigation policies, how developing, whether there's a trade-off for developing countries between climate change mitigation and economic growth, okay, development. Of course, the argument being that growth requires more energy use, and we're not at a stage yet where renewable energy is cheap enough or reliable enough to sustain high levels of growth, and therefore developing countries at present need to still rely on using energy that results in carbon emissions, and constraining them from doing that will impact their growth prospects, right? So that's basically the argument. And so topic 1 deals with sort of fleshing out that trade-off and how policymakers in developing countries should think about their response to climate change. And yes, part of the story is the fact that perhaps, okay, I've got a comment here from Amatolo that Ikamva will be down on the 23rd. Yes, I did see such a notice. It says unavailable from May 21 to Monday, May 24 at 12 a.m. Okay. I suppose I can extend the due date, given that I can extend the due date to Monday. Yeah, so you can submit on Monday in that case. Thanks for reminding me of that. I was going to look at this later, but yeah. So you can, thanks for that, Mamatolo. You can submit the following day. There's an hour difference between the original submission date, which was 11 p.m. on the 23rd, and the time that Canva reopens, which is 12 a.m. on the 24th. So if you wake up on Monday and forward your, well, not forward, but post your blog post on Monday, that's fine, right? Well, topic 2 deals with wealth taxation, and the topic is specified broadly. There are different types of wealth taxation, and as mentioned in a previous session, typically when we talk about wealth taxation, we're talking about taxes other than things like capital gains tax, estate duties, and property taxes, although those do fall under the broader rubric of wealth taxes, right? They are taxes based on accumulated assets or accumulated wealth. When we talk about wealth tax, we're talking about something slightly different in general, which is that in the case of the Argentinian example, there was a once-off tax that was implemented to fund COVID responses and so on, programs related to the response to COVID. Or you can have an annual wealth tax, which is something that's been mooted in some countries like the US. There is a tax on people's wealth every year based on their net worth, basically. So the idea is to discuss the prospects for such a tax in South Africa. And in terms of the blog, that's the essay topic. In terms of the blog, you are asked to write about, given that you've now done some background reading, hopefully those of you who have selected this topic on wealth taxes, you can make some informed and insightful comments on the performance of Argentina's wealth tax that they've implemented, which is discussed in these 2 articles that I linked to in this setup for topic 2. Then topic 3 deals with competition policy in South Africa, and here the setup is just this story that was reported widely last year when the Minister of Trade and Industry, Ibrahim Patel, declared that the reason they are restricting e-tailers, online commercial activity, in the same way that they were restricting physical brick and mortar retailers, is due to competition, right? So competition was invoked for this policy decision. So the setup here is more tangential, but I want you to sort of branch off of this setup, use the setup as a basis for discussing competition policy in South Africa more generally. A lot of people, a lot of commentators at least, have suggested very vociferously last year that this is a somewhat incompetent policy decision, invoking competition to restrict e-tailers. Then I added this since Tuesday. This last topic was not here on Tuesday. This is the budget competition topic. And I include a few links here for you all who want to pursue the budget competition topic, which I do strongly encourage. It would be great to have a winner, or at least a finalist from UWC once again. We haven't had a finalist in a while for this competition. And some of the links here relate to some data, some arguments presented by Treasury, but specifically in the NTBPS of last year. I had an appendix to the NTBPS in which they specifically focus on public sector compensation trends over time. And also I linked to a paper that was done by one of the staff members at the Reserve Bank, which argues that trends in public compensation seem to track or seem to correlate with trends in private sector compensation, which is sort of what Bamal argues, right? So we discussed Bamal's theory in the previous session in terms of one explanation for why there's less efficiency in government service provision. All right, so those are the topics that your blog will be based on. Then there are 4 examples of actual blog posts. So I didn't just link to blogs, I linked to specific blog posts that I found interesting and that I thought some of you may find interesting as well. First one is on this blog Not Boring, which deals with cryptocurrency. And this is something that I've been thinking about for a while now. Cryptocurrency, that is. Unfortunately, I didn't buy any, so I'm not rich, like many crypto millionaires and billionaires that have been produced over the last few years. I think there are a few thousand millionaires that have been produced, people who just bought some cryptocurrency. Unfortunately, I'm not one of them, but it's something I've been thinking about as a organizing mechanism, cryptocurrency, that is. And in fact, the second blog over here by Vitalik Buterin, if you don't know who that is, he's one of the co-founders and sort of the main brain behind Ethereum, which has been the fastest growing cryptocurrency, and is, in my view, perhaps even more important than Bitcoin, potentially. If you're following crypto debates, there's a lot of sort of tension in some areas of these two communities, respective communities, that is Bitcoin versus Ethereum. But what distinguishes the two primarily is the fact that Ethereum is programmable. It's more programmable than is Bitcoin. Bitcoin, on the other hand, is so-called more hard money. It's harder than Ethereum. Anyway, so Vitalik often writes about the potential for crypto as an organizing mechanism, and he also writes about a lot of his writing, or some of his writing, deals with some of the policy issues related to implementing cryptos or programs that are based on or that are structured on top of cryptocurrencies as organizing mechanisms for different things, whether it's DeFi, that is decentralized finance, or whether it's for contracting, all sorts of things. So he writes about the policy aspects about that, given the fact that that this idea of immutability and sort of perfect decentralization turns out not to be an accurate description of decentralized networks, decentralized ledger technology, or blockchains. Okay, so those are interesting from that perspective. If you sort of interested in that aspect of what's happening, of a current sort of phenomena, which is this emergence of cryptocurrency. Then the third one is by John Cochran, who's a guy, former University of Chicago professor. He has done a lot of work in financial economics, but also macroeconomics more generally, on the finance side, but also fiscal policy. And one of the contributors to this notion of the fiscal theory of the price level, which is a topic, an area that I'm supposed to be writing my PhD on, in the South African context and more generally in a small open economy context. So I read his work with some regularity. This particular blog post is about wealth inequality, and I thought it was interesting because he takes a contrasting view from what is typical, and he is has a somewhat libertarian bent to him, ideologically speaking. He has what in the US they refer to as a conservative bent, in his popular writing, that is on his blog, etc. His economics is economics, but his popular writing is more conservative, more libertarian. So he takes a sort of non-mainstream view on wealth inequality. And then Marginal Revolution is a blog that I read, that I go to basically every day. There are two writers on this blog. One is Alex Tabarrok, and the other is Tyler Cowen. Both of them are sort of microeconomists, and both write. The popular writing is often about policy issues. In this particular one, Alex Tabarrok expresses his view that this focus on patents, which has now become sort of prominent in the public discourse, that governments should relax their patent laws, so that in order to expand production of vaccines around the world. So he's taking the view that patents aren't the main constraint here in this case, but rather expanding capacity. And he's been arguing since this last year already, since early on in the pandemic, he's been arguing that they should now begin to generate the infrastructure to start rolling up, to start producing vaccines at mass scale. And I think, and in his view, that will be the major constraint when it comes to vaccine production, rather than patents. So I thought those were interesting, topical, relevant for current times blog posts for you to read. Okay, like I said, I will also post a blog post myself. I did write one, and just before I posted it, it disappeared, it vanished, which was extremely annoying. But I've since decided to write on something else. So look out for that in the next few days. Okay, so if you have any questions on Practical 2, you can go ahead and ask them, type them in the group chat, in the chat. Else we'll go ahead with chapter 18. Okay, so chapter 18 deals with the concept of fiscal federalism. We went through some of the earlier topics of this chapter on Tuesday. I'll just go over them briefly again. So just some background for this topic. We do observe in most countries that there are multiple levels of government administration, right? In the first lecture that we did for this course, we had a picture up showing the different levels of the different government tiers in South Africa. There were 3, excluding the public, excluding SOEs, of course. And those were national government, provincial government, and local government. So provincial and local is what we will refer to as subnational in the South African context. There are countries that have 3 tiers under national government. So they'll have sub, local, and something below local, perhaps districts or wards. And there are some countries that have only 1 tier. They have national and then local. And there aren't too many cases where you observe just a national structure, right? So subnational government is a level that is a smaller jurisdiction than national government. That is a geographic jurisdiction. And this graph over here just shows you the incidence of subnational governments across 101 countries. So most countries, 47 out of the 101, have 2 tiers of subnational governments, just like South Africa does. And then there are 31 countries that have only a single tier below national, and there are 23 countries that have 3 tiers below national. And if you plot the expenditure assignment as a share of GDP for these 101 countries, it turns out that South Africa actually lies quite high up in this regard. So in this graph, we have subnational expenditure as a proportion of GDP on the horizontal axis, and South Africa lies quite high. South Africa is the red circle over here, quite high on this axis. compared to the other 101 countries. Also, if you look at subnational government expenditure as proportion of public expenditure, South Africa lies quite high in that regard, lying at just under 50%. And as I suggested on Tuesday, this figure might exclude grants, but it's probably a bit higher if you include national grants in this measure. All right. But important to note, this is expenditure, right? So it might appear from this graph that subnational government is very important in terms of fiscal affairs in South Africa, but this is for expenditure only, right? And government activity involves more than just spending, right? There's also the tax side, there's also the policy side, there's the regulation side of it as well, right? So this is just one dimension. And on all of the other dimensions, South Africa probably lies a lot closer to would lie a lot lower on this vertical axis, okay? And I think we'll show some data to that effect later on. Okay, so what is the economic rationale for fiscal decentralization? One rationale is allocative efficiency, right? So producing the mix of public goods and services in accordance with preferences of citizens. Of course, within a given country, there will be diversity in terms of people's preferences for public goods and services, both in terms of what they would desire government to be doing, also in terms of how much they are willing to pay for that particular public good and service. And by breaking up jurisdictions that have different mixes of these two things, of provisions of public goods and services, citizens can sort of sort themselves into these different jurisdictions in accordance with their preferences, right? So that in that case, in that instance, or by that reasoning, you can promote allocative efficiency in the provision of public goods and services, right? Allocative efficiency, again, meaning that things are distributed in accordance with the desires or the preferences of citizens. So goods and services provided by SNGs are generally restricted to their geographic jurisdictions. Motor vehicle licenses in the Western Cape don't apply elsewhere, don't apply outside of the Western Cape, for instance. And this allows citizens to choose their desired mix of publicly supplied goods. Just as a sort of, just parenthetically, you can have spillovers. And the reason I'm now mentioning this parenthetically is because I just mentioned motor vehicle licenses. And it is the case that in the Western Cape, the motor vehicle license fees are somewhat higher than in some other provinces, which is one reason why you sometimes see lots of vehicles with license plates from other provinces. Of course, there are other reasons, people move, etc., or they purchase cars elsewhere and they license them out of convenience, but sometimes it's also a matter of the prices of things. So there is a bit of spillover and a bit of tax competition in essence, right? So if I live in the Western Cape and I license my vehicle in the Eastern Cape, that money goes to the Eastern Cape government, right? Okay, so that's just sort of a sidebar. Okay, boundaries between SNGs are, however, often determined by historical factors or political reasons. So it's not just a matter of preferences. It's not like people are freely moving to the jurisdictions where they feel the government there best represents their preferences. Often it's just the way things are, the way jurisdictions are divided are purely due to historical or political factors. In the last decade and a half, we saw in South Africa a spike in what came to be termed in the media the unrest that came to be labeled service delivery protests, right? In many instances, these so-called service delivery protests were related to this second bullet point here, right? Where people in a given municipality wanted to be either amalgamated or separated from some adjacent municipality. All right. Point number 2, decentralization acts as a countervailing force to the maximizing behavior of politicians. So again, again, in terms of having discussed this on Tuesday, the argument here is that a highly centralized state permits hiding from citizens inefficient activities or even outright adverse activities like corruption, etc. On the other hand, having public officials closer to the people, as it were, in brackets, in theory, should promote more accountability, right? And of course, this depends not just on the expenditure side of things, but also on the regulatory and the tax side of things. So if you pay tax to your local municipality and they are not using that money wisely, you'd be more inclined to be upset about that and make your voice heard in that regard. But it's by voting or through protest. Whereas if it's the national government, maybe there's less sort of opportunity to do that, right? Because you'd have to protest at one of the capital facilities, one of the national facilities, in order to do so. Okay. So in this way, you can mitigate some of the so-called maximizing behavior of politicians. And in the previous session, we talked about how economists think about political decision-making, that being that public officials, much like individuals, are trying to maximize their utility, and firms are trying to maximize profits. Politicians are trying to maximize votes or trying to maximize power. And in doing so, this can result in some adverse behaviors or some inefficient behaviors, such as empire building, etc. In other words, undertaking more expenditure than is necessary, right? In an effort to legitimize larger budgets, right? And that's in essence where political power comes from. And of course, some of this is associated to corruption as well, because the larger your budget, the more opportunity there is for so-called tenderpreneuring, etc. All right. So Tibet developed this model which attempts to explain why we observe local governments, why we observe subnational governments, as well as to explain why having subnational governments is efficient, allocatively efficient. So the model is premised on a bunch of assumptions, as is usually the case in economics. I'm simplifying assumptions so as to get at the main insights. So in Tibet's model, some might say Tibet, we have the following assumptions. All citizens are mobile. All citizens have complete information on taxes, services, and jurisdictions. There's a large number of jurisdictions which spans the full range of public good combinations desired by citizens, right? So no one's left out in this model in terms of being able to satisfy their preferences for the mix of public goods and services. Sibabalwe has a hand up. Please go ahead, Sibabalwe.
So what exactly is meant by fully mobile? Does that mean like cars, or in which capacity is fully mobile meant?
Okay, I see that you are speaking, but I'm not able to hear you for some reason.
Can you hear me now, sir?
I can hear you.
Okay. I was asking, can you please go into detail about what is meant by fully mobile? Do they mean like as in cars, or like what capacity is that meant in?
Yeah, so look, with these simple models, much like in the case of the benchmark model we looked at, the assumptions are extremely simplifying and extremely abstract. Okay, so when they talk about fully mobile, what they mean here is there's no friction that inhibits people from choosing between jurisdictions, right? In other words, if you happen to live in a municipality that does not necessarily reflect your preferences for the mix of public goods and services you want to see provided, and there's some other jurisdiction far away from where you are that does, nothing holds you back from just moving to that jurisdiction, right? In fact, in an abstract, you can think of it very abstractly. So by frictionless, what I mean is you can imagine that you can just port yourself to that other jurisdiction, right? There's no cost in moving there. There's no, you have no ties to a job in a given jurisdiction or anything else, right? That's basically what we mean by mobile, right? All citizens have the capacity to choose the jurisdiction that best represents them, and they can move there. Okay, so nothing is constraining them. And you can imagine yeah, please go ahead.
No, I was just saying thank you, so I understand now.
All right, yeah. To see why this assumption matters, whenever you account a set of assumptions, think about what would be the implication of that assumption not holding. Right? With any model, that's one way to kind of try and understand how a given model gets to the insight that it does. So if, for instance, if this didn't hold, if citizens were not mobile, then you won't have allocative efficiency. Because citizens would for whatever reason, be stuck in a jurisdiction that does not represent their interests, that does not provide the mix of public goods they desire. Yet there is another jurisdiction that does, right? And they can't get there for whatever reason. In which case you would not have allocative efficiency. And the idea of this model is to demonstrate the conditions under which you might have allocative efficiency in the provision of public goods and services. Okay. But so we have to make that assumption. Okay, so individuals are, and this first one is linked to the fourth one over here. Individuals are not tied to a particular location through job or family ties, right? They're linked in the sense that both of these introduce a friction to movement, to a jurisdiction that you might desire, that might reflect your preferences. Okay, right. So three is important because it says that all citizens' preferences can be met in this framework. Then there are no spillovers between jurisdictions, also important, because again, if there were such things as spillovers, if one jurisdiction produced a mix of goods and services desired by some subset of a population, and an adjacent one did not, but it benefited from the spillover from the initial jurisdiction, citizens can move to that one that is just adjacent to the one that represents their preferences, but where they may not have to pay for those goods and services they desire, right? So then the free rider problem creeps in if you don't make this assumption over here. Then there are no economies of scale in production of public goods and services. Again, not having this assumption here introduces the scope for free riding, right? Okay, so the implications of this model, the results, the predictions, in essence, based on the assumptions given, are as follows. So individuals will sort themselves into communities of like preferences for a given mix of public goods and services, as well as taxation. A large number of SMGs will emerge, right? And again, you can think of this in an extreme case where preferences at very small levels can be represented, small group levels, and in the absolute limit at the individual level, right? So a large number of SMGs, each offering a different mix of public goods and taxation, will enable individuals to reveal their preferences for local provision of public goods. And by the way, I mentioned earlier that a lot of the discussion in the crypto community centers around this idea of enabling new types of communities in societies, right? Not just centered around finance, but other ways of contracting. And ultimately, the idea is to even think about different types of providing and funding public goods and services. Implementing decentralized ledger technology, and this is a sort of a not a new almost utopian vision of the techno, what I call the techno utopians. there was, not too long ago, there was a move by the same people who are touting the benefits of crypto and decentralized ledger technology. There was a plan to move communities offshore, outside of countries, specifically in the States. But the idea was that this could proliferate to other countries as well, where people who didn't want to be bound by a government, by a state, could set up structures in the ocean and just live there and create communities like that. So the idea is that, well, that's not quite feasible. It's expensive, and who wants to live out in the ocean forever? And so the idea is that we can do this now virtually with the introduction of decentralized ledger technology that sort of skirts, that operates outside of the current regulatory framework of states, right? Okay, so just another sort of tangent that you can explore, some rabbit hole you can fall down at some point. All right, so the larger number of SNGs and the greater variation in taxes and services, the larger the number of SNGs, the closer citizens will be to satisfying their preferences for public provision of services. Right? That's one implication of this model. And the model effectively suggests that decentralization creates a quasi-market mechanism in which people vote with their feet. And the implication of this is that, in essence, jurisdictions may compete for people, right? Government needs tax-paying people, right, in order to provide goods and services, and the politicians who occupy positions, as well as the public officials that occupy positions within government, want to spend, right? They want budgets because that's what they're there for. That's their main purpose, is to spend budgets. And of course, spending budgets creates opportunities, like I mentioned, for things like targeting those budgets at certain communities, etc., or individuals for that matter. And so therefore they want to compete for citizens, and this competition can, in essence, drive innovation in the provision of public goods and services, as well as discouraging suboptimal governments or government activities. Okay, now of course there are several critiques, and again we're not too worried about the critique of oversimplification of the model. We understand that easy simplification, as are all models, even physics models are simplifications of reality. Of course, there's a qualitative difference between physics models and economics models, but the point is that you critique a model for simplification as a critique of a model is not always really deeply insightful. Okay, so one critique is that switching jurisdictions is not the only way that people influence the mix of taxation, right? So this is one of the assumptions is that in the model is that given that people are highly mobile, nothing holds them down, they will go to a jurisdiction that best represents their preferences. But that's not necessarily the case, right? People may want to try and change the mix of policies or goods and services, public goods and services, in the jurisdiction where they exist, rather than moving to a different one that better represents their preferences. The model has been extended to address this critique, as well as some of the other critiques also. And you can read more about that in the textbook. The role of property taxes is also important, as this is often the main source of revenue at municipal level. And this is an important one. So one of the implications of the model is that we will see the value of the differences across municipalities. So the idea is that when you have this variation in mixes of public goods and services, you also have variation in what is being offered effectively. And you can think of this as a market, right? So there's a competition between different market participants, and they're offering goods and services of different value to people. And this value will be reflected in property prices. Initially, this idea wasn't present in the model, right? This idea that if there is value to be gained from living in a particular jurisdiction, that value must reflect in some way, right? And it must reflect particularly in property prices, which in fact is what we do observe empirically, right? And some might argue that is one reason why property prices in Cape Town are so high, which is, of course, this is complicated by a lot of things, but one of the reasons that people may present as an argument is that that people value the level of public goods and services, or the mix of public goods and services provided in the Western Cape, and by the city of the municipality of Cape Town versus other municipalities and other provinces. Okay, so when considering the model, if you exclude this idea of property taxes being one outcome of differences in value across jurisdictions, then you do introduce the potential for free riding, right? Which, as we know from previous discussions, results in allocatively inefficient outcomes. So if value does not reflect in property prices, free riders can purchase low value property to avoid paying high taxes, yet receive the same benefit as high value property. So that's another critique. Also, the model ignores the role of redistribution, right? So again, and you'll notice a trend here in economics where certainly mid to late 20th century economics, where the role of redistribution didn't have the salience, didn't have the importance that it does today, right? And part of the reason is that we've observed this explosion explosion is a superlative word. We've observed this significant increase in income inequality and wealth inequality across the world. And so redistribution has come to occupy a much more salient, has become more salient in the discipline, right? Whereas older economics didn't really pay too much attention to redistribution as an objective, right? Okay, so some of the empirical findings that have come out of people trying to apply this model and trying and evaluate to what extent we observe the implications of the model out in the world are given in the textbook. So a review of 200 articles made the following conclusions on the evidence for the implications of the Tibet model. Firstly, citizens in countries with a larger number of local jurisdictions do appear to enjoy higher satisfaction levels. And here the evidence is somewhat mixed. Excuse me. So there is some evidence for this proposition, for this implication. There is some evidence that goes against this implication as well. Another implication is that the larger the number of competing local jurisdictions, the more homogeneous each will be, right? So that relates to this idea that citizens will sort themselves into the jurisdictions that they believe best represents the interest, and therefore there will be some homogeneity within jurisdictions and more heterogeneity across jurisdictions, right? That's one implication of the model. And the review that's discussed in the textbook suggests that there's weak evidence to support this claim. So there is evidence that we do observe some homogeneity within jurisdictions, but the evidence is rather weak. Then another implication is that the rich citizens may band together to avoid paying higher taxes for redistributive purposes, right? There's some evidence in developed countries to support this claim, right? Then the higher quality of another implication is that higher quality of services, the higher the quality of services, the higher the property values in a given jurisdiction. And here we observe somewhat weak evidence to support this. And this will probably vary across countries based on different contexts, right? Some countries will have sort of a more consistent level of quality of public services across jurisdictions, regardless of the income distribution across those those jurisdictions. Another implication is that relocation decisions are influenced by tax and service bundles offered by jurisdictions. So this is one of the main implications of this model. And there is evidence that does support this, empirical evidence does support this. But of course, there are always confounding factors when we do empirical work in economics. And the results can be open to other interpretations. But the data do provide some potentially, does provide some evidence for this. Okay, public choice and other theories. Again, we're talking about SMGs here. So what are the public choice theories related to subnational governments? And are there any other theories that hold some insights for why we observe subnational government or why it's desirable? So public choice perspective on fiscal federalism considers public officials and voters to be rational actors who have utility functions that they aim to maximize. So one implication of this theory is that we may observe the oversupply of public goods since public officials aim to maximize their bureaucracies, right? So as I mentioned earlier, the assumption that public officials behave just like any other maximizing agent in an economy, and they are trying to maximize something. The what of what they're trying to maximize would be the empires, effectively, the budgets of the departments or of the level of government, etc., or the votes, right? So, and one can think of this in different ways. So, in the US, for example, there's a lot of talk among politicians that, and this was very prominent under Reagan in the 80s, government has to get out of the way, we have to reduce the size of government, business is more important, etc., etc. And so which would suggest that it's going against this point over here, which suggests that politicians want to maximize utility by maximizing budgets, by raising budgets. But often that is just rhetoric. Even under President Reagan, budget deficits increased, the size of government increased, and the same goes for subsequent periods, right? Another implication here, well, another sort of counter argument to this observation that in some countries we observe politicians suggesting, no, we want to actually reduce our involvement in the economy, etc., etc., is that bureaucrats, they expand their power, they gain power through other means, right? Through corporate endorsements, through cronyism, what we call crony capitalism, right? So politicians who make the kinds of noises that are favorable to corporations, saying that we want to reduce taxes, we want businesses to flourish, we want government size to decrease, etc., will find favor from corporations who would be sympathetic to those views, and they'll get funding from in that way, right? Okay, so this in turn implies that government officials wish to maximize tax revenue, assuming that this is true, point one above. Then both these implications may result in a suboptimal allocation of public goods, right? So an over-provision of public goods in this case, which some would suggest to some degree does describe what is happening in South Africa, right? For instance, with the provision, particularly with the SOEs, right? So government running ESCOM and government having this airline, running this airline may be thought of as an over-provision of services. And of course, an airline is not necessarily a public good, at least not anymore. Right, fiscal decentralization, and there are other ways in which you can sort of ascribe this description to the South African context as well. Fiscal decentralization in this setting could restrict the tendency of governments to maximize revenue and expenditure, again, in part due to competition, across jurisdictions, again, in part due to greater accountability to the citizens who are the beneficiaries of the goods and services that bureaucrats, that government is providing. And this is because there's generally a closer link between taxes and spending at local levels, right? And this is where earlier I mentioned in that chart that showed South Africa lying sort of relatively high on the vertical axis, which showed subnational government expenditure as a proportion of total government expenditure. And this is where this critique might apply to South Africa, because the taxes that are being spent at the subnational government level are not being generated at the subnational government, right? Particularly for provinces. And the idea here that this point is making is linking those two things, right? Linking taxes and spending. So if you are paying a tax for a particular expenditure at a local level, then it's likely that you're going to be more inclined to hold, not you as an individual, but a group of the citizenry of a given jurisdiction. It's likely that they're going to hold those officials more accountable. Whereas if that community is paying, let's say the citizens of Cape Town, if they're paying taxes to national government, as we do through income tax, VAT, etc., and even though some of that funding is being filtered back down to the local level and being spent, there's a break in that link, right? In that instance, between the taxes and the spending at the local level. Okay. Further reasons for fiscal federalism. So this is the public choice perspective. Then there are other reasons for fiscal federalism or decentralized government, and that is innovation. And we have mentioned this before, which is that competition may arise between subnational jurisdictions, which can spur innovation in policy making or service delivery. So successful local government experiments may then be replicated, whereas failed experiments may then be discarded. Of course, this is theoretical, but we do observe governments trying to be more sort of innovative and trying to experiment a bit. One of the ways that has been promoted for the past few decades, but hasn't seen too much success, is the idea of charter cities, which has a very which may have a policy mix that is very favorable to trying to promote certain types of activities, entrepreneurship, etc., or even industrial policy and that sort of thing. So there is innovation happening across municipal jurisdictions. Complete centralization may come at a cost to decision making due to the magnitude of jurisdiction and may involve complex processes. And this is certainly relevant in South Africa, where there is certainly at the policy process, in the policy making process, there's a lot of there's a high degree of centralization. However, there's also a high degree of inclusion, of inclusiveness, right? So we do in our budget process, for example, it's quite an extensive process which involves government officials from local, provincial, and national departments. It's not just the official treasuries who are sitting and together with, say, national cabinet and the president, who are sitting and making decisions about the budget. It does involve the subnational level as well, and it's a very complex process. It's a very extensive process as well, and therefore expensive, both in terms of time, in terms of cost, and in terms of just making decisions, having to account for a host of different views, which is a good thing. We want to be inclusive, etc. But it's not without its costs. I remember when I was working at the provincial treasury a few years back, and we had a delegation from Germany come and visit visit the treasury there, and they were quite impressed with how inclusive our budget process was, and how many views were included in the whole decision-making process. But they made the point when they heard, we had a meeting where we discussed our processes and so on, and they discussed theirs, and they made some comments on how things happen here in South Africa, and they made the point that this is quite costly as well, and also it introduces the potential for some friction, right, in decision making. Okay, then decentralization encourages public participation in decision making, since local authorities are closer to the people. Again, suggesting this idea of accountability as a result of closing the gap between the citizens being served and the politicians, the government officials doing the serving. Okay. So we've suggested a whole bunch of reasons for why we observe subnational governments, why it's potentially efficient, why it potentially promotes allocative efficiency in the provision of public goods and services. But there are also good reasons for centralization. Where local authorities are concerned, for instance, mainly with the well-being of their own residents, goods and external benefits may be underprovided, right? Goods with external benefits. So if the Western Cape introduces provides some good or service that has an external benefit for surrounding provinces, they may be less inclined to fund that activity, right? Because some of the benefit is extending to citizens from other jurisdictions who are not paying for it, right? Centralization could, and in such cases, it's useful to have a central authority that implements that particular activity. Also, centralization could be beneficial when economies of scale afford more efficient provision of goods and services. That's sort of an obvious point. It may lead to lower costs of compliance and enforcement, again, relating to economies of scale effects, such as having a single revenue collection entity instead of an entity for each province, for instance. Then, in practice, some services are best provided at national level, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later. And others may be more suitably provided at subnational level. Again, we'll get into that in a moment. The types of how we assign the duties at different levels, or the types of duties that are best assigned at different levels. And likewise, some taxes are better administered at national level, and others are better administered at the local level. Okay, so this raises a question: what is the optimal degree of fiscal decentralization? And this is something I want you to think about, right? So centralization has its benefits. It is efficient in some ways. Subnational provision of goods and services also has its own benefits that we've now discussed. So that leaves us with the question of, given that we have this spectrum of centralization on the one hand and decentralization on the other, what degree of decentralization is most efficient? We know that absolute centralization is not necessarily ideal. So what degree of decentralization is best, and what is best for South Africa? On Tuesday I mentioned that the provincial sort of layer of the public administration has been somewhat contentious in South Africa. And addressing this question, one way to think about this question in the South African context is to ask, should we just get rid of provinces entirely? Or going the other way, should we assign more duties, more powers to provinces, right? In other words, should we increase centralization or reduce centralization? Of course, we can also, by getting rid of provinces, promote more decentralization by assigning duties and responsibilities currently undertaken at provincial level to the local level, right? But we have to think about capacity constraints and coordination issues, etc. Okay, so now let's talk about the assignment problem when it comes to thinking about centralized government versus decentralized government. Okay, so what do we mean by the assignment problem? This is concerned with how spending and taxation responsibilities should be assigned among national and subnational governments. I would also include the policy, right? Not just spending and taxation, but also policy. In the South African case, although we have two tiers of subnational governments, these levels have very limited taxing powers relative to national government, right? Spending responsibilities with respect to the share of total spending are certainly more evenly distributed across the levels of government. However, decision-making powers on how to spend is often highly centralized, and that is particularly the case for provinces. Okay, now let's think about the different functions of the different levels of government, or the functions of government for that matter. And let's discuss the functions of government in the context of decentralized versus, or national level versus subnational levels. So it's widely accepted that certain functions like monetary policy and fiscal policy are best left to national government. And we don't have to discuss this too much. It doesn't make sense for each province to have its own currency or to have monetary policy decision-making powers, right, at that level, because the incentive is there to engage in activities that can ultimately lead to suboptimal macroeconomic outcomes, such as inflation, for instance, by expanding the money supply to fund activities. Also, it would be difficult for a given subnational government to reap the benefits of any fiscal policy undertaken at subnational government, since much of the benefits could flow to other subnational jurisdictions. So again, fiscal policy is best undertaken at national level. Certain taxes like personal income tax and corporate income tax are also best administered at national level, as these play a key macroeconomic stabilization role. Some countries do have income taxes at the subnational government. So very often you have instances where there's a federal income tax that applies, and then in addition to that, you have a subnational income tax, right? So you pay income tax to national government, and then separately you pay income tax to your local jurisdiction, usually at the provincial level or state level. In South Africa, our constitution does permit such a tax to be implemented here. In other words, the Eastern Cape can decide it's going to, in addition to the income tax that people have to pay to national government, they can implement a surcharge on that tax. So, so they can force the citizens of the Eastern Cape to pay the national income tax as they currently are, but then also to pay the Eastern Cape government an income tax, surcharge on income tax, they call it. But of course, that is highly infeasible given our current income tax rates in South Africa. Then there's the distribution function, and here is where there's a strong case for national government, right? So a key feature of government is its capacity to change the distribution of income within a country through its tax and transfer system, and this is best administered at national level. Because of efficiency and just the administrative capacity to undertake redistribution activities, tax and transfer. Excuse me. There's an argument that income redistribution in one subnational government will incentivize poor individuals to move there from other jurisdictions, right? Will result in suboptimal outcomes. Another argument is that high-income individuals will sort of segregate themselves into a low-tax jurisdiction to escape redistributive taxation. So you could have a few more Oranjes popping up, but in this instance, not because of racism, but because of the wealthy trying to segregate themselves from the less well. Okay, then there's the allocation function. So there's an argument that fiscal decentralization has the potential to secure greater efficiency gains Also, the central argument is that subnational jurisdictions could tailor their tax services packages more closely to the preferences of local citizenry, whereas more centralized policies force all jurisdictions to consume the same mix of taxes and services, right? And again, so this gets to this argument of efficiency, particularly allocative efficiency, because different jurisdictions may have different citizens in different jurisdictions may have different preferences, as discussed under the Tibet model. And given that that is the case, it may be more efficient for certain policies or certain activities to be undertaken at the subnational level rather than the national level. And one of the arguments for this is that subnational governments will have more information on the preferences of residents at the local levels, given local conditions. Okay? It's also sometimes more politically convenient to permit decentralization to maintain the stability of federations. Right? So in the last few years, we've witnessed a few instances of potential secession, particularly in Canada and Spain, Quebec in Canada, Catalonia. These are jurisdictions within these respective countries, Quebec in Canada, Catalonia in Spain. There have been moves towards secession, and one way of dealing with this is what we call devolution, which is assigning more powers to local levels. We saw something similar in the UK. This is pre-Brexit. So before Brexit, there was Scotland threatened to secede from Britain, and there was a huge discussion about devolution during that time. That is, giving more autonomy to local jurisdictions, and that's one way of countering this type of problem, right? So it could be destabilizing when you have a part of a country that secedes. In other words, breaks away, right? And there's a move in the Western Cape for that matter. Some of you may be aware of a political party. It doesn't have a lot of support, at least not presently, but this party is arguing that the Western Cape should secede from the rest of South Africa. And one way of countering this, let's say this movement gains a lot of steam and it becomes sort of politically problematic. One way of countering this for the national government is to assign more authority. So give the provinces more taxing capacity and more policy-making decision capacity and that sort of thing, right? Okay, public services are provided efficiently by a jurisdiction that has control over the minimum geographic area that would internalize the benefits and costs of this provision. So some sorts of functions are best assigned at the national level, such as defense, whereas other types of functions are best assigned at the provincial or local level due to the differences in the geographies, in the geographic contexts, right? So if you think of forestry services, for example, you might not want to have that as a national competency because some provinces may not require that service. You can think of the Northern Cape, for instance, might not be in much need of forestry services. And so it's perhaps best to assign that at the provincial level, to have that competency at the provincial level. Also, diseconomies of scale and increasing bureaucratic inefficiency could arise when spending programs serve too large a geographic area. And there's an argument that contestation among SMG jurisdictions could have benefits similar to competition in private markets. Again, this idea of innovation that arises due to different jurisdictions, attempting different ways of doing things, different ways of administering a municipal government or a provincial government. And in that sense, similar to a normal market, you may give rise to competition across municipalities or across provinces, and this could promote better outcomes in general, because if one municipality sees another municipality doing something that is working, they might want to copy that. And if one municipality sees a different one doing something that is clearly not working, they could avoid that, right? All right, so in this way, competition and contestation across jurisdictions could give rise, across subnational governments could give rise to dynamism in the provision of public goods and services and administration, as well as innovation. Okay, naturally, improved allocative efficiency in decentralized systems depends on political and institutional mechanisms through which SNGs can be made aware of citizens' preferences and whether accountability mechanisms are in place, right? So we've touted the benefits of subnational governments, but these benefits can only be realized in instances where the mechanisms that give effect to these benefits are actually in place, right? So are citizens' preferences, are they able to reveal their preferences, and are their preferences being observed and responded to at a subnational government level? Also, are the accountability mechanisms in place to hold officials at and bureaucrats at subnational government level accountable? In many developing countries, these mechanisms are not in place, right? Or where they are in place, they may not necessarily be well functioning. A lack of capacity at subnational government, as well as corruption, may influence the realization of allocative efficiency that could arise from decentralization. And there's an argument we made that we do observe this in South Africa to some degree. Again, referencing those so-called service delivery protests I mentioned earlier, in which citizens clearly felt that there isn't much accountability, that there isn't a sufficient response to the preferences, to the needs of citizens, and took to the streets to protest. Okay, so although greater efficiency through decentralization is attainable in principle, in practice, success does depend on contextual factors that I just mentioned. Okay, now let's talk about tax assignment. So tax assignment refers to the assignment of tax powers to different tiers of government, and expenditure assignment refers to the assignment of expenditure functions to different tiers of government. And as I mentioned earlier, these are quite distinct, and there can be a break between these two things, right? Intuitively, it would seem that tax assignment should complement expenditure assignment, right? So we imagine that that expenditure undertaken in the Western Cape should follow from the tax that is generated in the Western Cape, right? But that's not necessarily the case. So we imagine that the greater expenditure assignment for a given tier of government, the greater the tax power should be. The difference between expenditure and taxes, as the difference between these two things increases, subnational governments become increasingly dependent on grants from national governments to fund expenditure, right? So if subnational government is given expenditure powers that exceed the revenue they are able to generate given their taxing powers, then that means the expenditures must be funded by national government, right? And this has a host of implications. One of them is that it may hinder accountability. And we mentioned this earlier, where I said that you may be if citizens are paying taxes to the national government, but the goods and services they receive may be implemented, may be provided at the local or provincial level. So there's this break between where the taxes go and then how the goods and services are provided to citizens. And this does hinder it does break this link between expenditure and tax, and therefore also breaks hinders this accountability mechanism of being closer to the people, right? Okay, appropriate tax assignment must consider two factors: equity, so that's horizontal and vertical equity across taxpayers and regions, And then also efficiency, which is minimizing the cost of collection and compliance, as well as any price distortions to factors of production that influence private action. So we've discussed this extensively before, and of course you've discussed these two issues in your macroeconomics course as well, right? So these are the two of the properties of a good tax, right? Is that you observe horizontal and vertical equity across taxpayers as well as across regions. Horizontal equity meaning that people with similar incomes pay similar tax rates and pay similar levels of taxes, and vertical equity suggesting that people with higher taxes should be paying, people with higher income should pay higher taxes than people with lower income. And these sound like obvious things, but it's not necessarily the case. It's not always necessarily the case. And then efficiency, again, relating to both compliance in terms of the cost of compliance. So you don't want taxes to be onerous. You don't want people to spend weeks figuring out how much taxes they need to pay. Are they going to go to jail if they don't get this right? It can be very stressful. Or having to hire accountants. In some places, this is a real problem. In the US, it's often reported how onerous the tax issue is there. It's very complicated, and also often people have to actually hire a professional to help them sort out their taxes. And I'm not talking about people with small businesses, just normal people with jobs. Sometimes have to resort to that. And that relates to compliance. Then there's also the issue of distortions, right? Particularly price distortions, because as mentioned before, and we'll look at this again in I think chapter 11 or 12, taxes do distort prices, right? When you put a tax on something, the price of that thing changes, and that has implications for the demand and supply of that good or service, which then spills over into other markets, right? And so you want to minimize, given the conditions of the benchmark model, you want to minimize any distortions that can be introduced by implementing a tax, right? Any economic distortions. That, as ever, could result in an inefficient allocation of goods and services, retail inefficient allocation of goods and services. Okay, so here's some guidelines for tax assignment. Taxes are best assigned at the taxes that are best assigned to national government include progressive redistributive taxes such as personal income tax. Also, taxes that are appropriate for macroeconomic stabilization. Again, this includes personal income tax because just due to the scale of that as a revenue source for government, as well as VAT, which is the second largest revenue source for government. Then taxes with geographically unequal tax bases. Mining, for example. So some jurisdictions can generate a lot of revenue for certain activities. You can think of mining in the northern provinces, but we may want to distribute. It just so happens that we've got minerals underground in those areas. And we may want to distribute the gains from those benefits of having those minerals more broadly, and so therefore you want to have taxes administered at the national level in such instances. Taxes on mobile factors of production as well, again, so that you don't have this distortive effect of entities, be that individuals or firms, moving to different jurisdictions to either escape onerous taxes or to benefit from lower taxes elsewhere, right? So you want that also to be implemented at the national level. Now, of course, we've decided on VAT, and VAT is generally considered in public economics to be more efficient than a sales tax for this reason. But some countries still implement sales taxes, right? And then you observe tax competition, etc. In the US, for example, you have a sales tax, and there's significant differences across states in the US with respect to the sales taxes. Okay, taxes best assigned to subnational government include residence-based taxes, such as taxes on fuel levy or taxes on alcohol. Also taxes on immobile factors. There's a lot of compliance involved, for instance, with alcohol. And again, this is a very good example of preference revelation. Some provinces can have vastly different both policies and tax rates on when it comes to alcohol, right? Some people can be more liberal in this regard. In other words, I mean, it's feasible. If you travel overseas, one of the things you notice, especially in Europe, is that is how freely available alcohol is, and how unrestricted the consumption of alcohol is. So you can go to your local Pick and Pay, in the equivalent of a Pick and Pay in Europe, and well, in many countries in Europe, and buy alcohol off the shelf, and you can walk out of the shop and consume it right there on the street, and you won't be breaking the law by doing that. So you can imagine something that extreme, perhaps, unless national law prohibits that, and you can imagine much more restrictive policies and higher taxes on alcohol in some provinces. Also taxes on immobile factors of production. So the big one here is property taxes, right? And this should be assigned to local authorities. Property is immobile, so unlike firms and individuals that can move across jurisdictions, property cannot be moved. So it is efficient to have that tax assignment at subnational government level. And also it's better for administrative purposes, right? So rather than have a national department with a bunch of offices around the country and different municipalities, it's best to have this being administered at the municipal level, right? Also, it's more efficient. Also, user charges and benefit taxes could be assigned to all tiers of government. Okay? So user charges are things that people pay at the point of consumption for, right? So, for instance, if you go to a national park, you walk through the gate, you have to pay at the gate. That's a user charge. And this can be administered at different levels. So you'll have some national parks that are administered by national government, and you'll have some parks that are administered at municipal level. Okay. Now let's talk about tax competition versus tax harmonization. Okay, so what is tax competition? We've got 5 minutes left, so I'll just get through this very quickly, because I don't want to stretch this chapter over too many sessions. So tax competition is when subnational governments adjust their tax rates to attract mobile factors of production. When different subnational governments impose different tax rates, citizens and firms may respond by moving to lower tax jurisdictions. Right, so this is subnational governments actively competing with each other to attract either citizens or firms, for that matter. Tax harmonization, on the other hand, is when subnational governments coordinate their tax policies. So one example of this is by limiting the degree of variation in tax rates, or by defining the tax bases in a uniform way. In other words, they're not going to, Western Cape isn't going to look at Eastern Cape and say, okay, this is what they're doing in terms of property taxes. We're going to do things differently so that we can attract the wealthier people, wealthier individuals to come and move to the Western Cape and invest in property here and pay property taxes here. Rather, you have coordination around how to set property rates, how to define thresholds, and all these sorts of things. Okay, so tax competition was originally thought to be distortionary and likely to result in suboptimal outcomes. For the reason, given the example that I just mentioned, right? So you don't want people making decisions based on differences in tax rates. It was thought that if one subnational government decided to compete on tax rates, other provinces may respond in kind also lowering taxes, right? And this gives rise to this idea of the bigger than neighbor policy. And we're talking about it in the context of within state, within country, but we see this play out in the international sphere as well, right? Where some countries have very low tax rates, especially island states, and in doing so, they are attracting firms to set up shop there. There's a reason why all the major tech companies have offices in Ireland. Right? Ireland has an extremely low tax rate, especially for a developed country that has all the nice infrastructure, etc., and links to financial markets and all these sorts of things. And the same thing can play out at subnational governments, right? And this does happen in some countries to a moderate degree. It's never too big a deal, but it's happening. The US is perhaps a good example. US is often a good example for many public economics things, in part because much of the theory and economics theory in general gets developed in the US. But also the US is it's a very diverse country in terms of not only its people, but in terms of the policy positions across people within the country, and the actual policies undertaken across states within and subnational jurisdictions within the US. So right now there's a move, for instance, by some states to try and attract a lot of the tech companies to move to their particular state, such as Florida and Texas. So tech companies, most of the tech companies have their main offices in California, in a particular part of California called Silicon Valley, which is just outside of San Francisco. Part of that is just for historical reasons. That's where, and it's called Silicon Valley because that's where I think Intel had its main offices, and lots of the chip manufacturers had their operations running there. And as a result of this, an ecosystem just developed there over time that was favorable to tech-focused entrepreneurship and venture capital and so on. And some other states in the US are trying to attract those businesses through tax rates, through policy. Okay, another outcome. I see it's 10 o'clock, so I think we should stop there. We've gone on probably for too long. Okay, thanks everyone. We'll continue and hopefully finish this section on Tuesday. I'll try and be more pithy. In fact, I was thinking that perhaps we can forego the session on Friday of next week to just give you a break and give myself a break and give you an opportunity to catch up on things and work on your blog post over the weekend. Okay, so I will see you on Tuesday. Have a good weekend, everyone. Thanks for your attention. I'll stay around for a few minutes in case any of you have any questions. But please feel free to log off.